me make a few comments. I've been interspersing comments about the road to serfdom. A few comments. I think we won't have time to look at specific passages. Sorry about that, but I'll call them to your attention, and then we'll open the floor to questions, concerns, objections, dissent. The road to serfdom. I've mentioned something about Hayek's biography, an Austrian economist, a winner of the Nobel Prize, obviously highly proficient technical economist who, as a kind of moonlighting undertaking, wrote The Road to Serfdom, but explicating the political principles that underlie capitalism and liberal democracy, became a kind of second career for him after 1944, after the publication of The Road to Serfdom. So again, the central claim of The Road to Serfdom is that both forms of totalitarianism that had arisen in Europe in the 20th century, left and right, Marxism and National Socialism, Nazism, were expressions of the central socialist aim of assigning to the state responsibility for economic planning. I've mentioned that economic freedom is the prerequisite of other freedoms, that the system of private property is the most important guarantee, not only of private property, but the whole range of freedoms we cherish. And this I want to also emphasize. This is a core insight that informs Hayek's economic analysis and his political analysis. It's an insight about the severe limits on human knowledge, especially compared to the knowledge that can be generated by free markets, through the pricing system, through the bargaining, through the competition of countless individuals. No central planner in Washington, or for that matter, Moscow, Paris, Berlin, London, whatever capital, can possibly, no team of experts can possibly accumulate and synthesize information about people's wants, needs, and desires in the way that the free market system does. As a result, to act on the opposite supposition, that we know enough to engage in central planning, is not only an act of hubris, an act of unjustified pride, but it courts disaster. And once again, on this, the historical record, which, I'm sorry to repeat, is so inadequately taught in schools today, but the historical record is unambiguous. All right. I mentioned that The Road to Serfdom in 1944 was a surprise bestseller. I think the original run was 2,000 copies. Hundreds of thousands were sold in the 1940s. The book has established itself as a classic. If you want to wrestle with the best statement of the principles of freedom, of political and economic freedom we have available, I think you can't do better than Hayek's Road to Serfdom and The Constitution of Liberty, which he published approximately 1960. The 1944 book is his effort to warn about the dangers of socialism. The 1960 book is a kind of positive book to reconstruct and restate the principles of freedom for a new generation. Hayek is often called a classical liberal. That's fair, as long as we understand the following. For Hayek, classical liberal is not equivalent to libertarian. Classical liberal is equivalent to people who roughly defend the following two propositions: that human beings are by nature free and equal, and the central political task is to protect our freedom, including markets, the system of laws that enable people to compete effectively. By that definition, Friends of Liberty and classical liberalism includes men like Tocqueville and men like Edmund Burke, who are typically, at least in Burke's case, is typically and correctly thought of as a father of modern conservatism. A few quick observations now, specific observations about our selection. As I've already mentioned, you can see this on pages 39 and 40 of the Distillation. Hayek, against the intellectual currents of the time, insisted that National Socialism in Germany was not primarily abled by individuals of wicked intentions, although he does not underestimate the world historical wickedness of Adolf Hitler, but the grounds were laid by people who wanted to concentrate in government power over the most important economic decisions. Second point, you see this on pages 42 through 44. What is individualism, according to Hayek? Today, in many sectors, maybe some of you have read a book called by Patrick Deneen or heard about it called Why Liberalism Failed, or a book by Yoram Chazoni called The Virtue of Nationalism. Individualism, interestingly, especially among certain fashionable conservatives, has become a term of opprobrium, something you should avoid. For Hayek, individualism is the highest achievement of Western civilization. What does he mean by individualism? He does not mean simply, he doesn't even mean fundamentally, going your own way, doing whatever you please, living outside of community, totally breaking free from tradition. What he means by individualism is a point of view that says the individual is of infinite worth, of essential dignity, and the political expression of the dignity that we think inheres in individuals is to the extent possible, consistent with the freedom of others, to respect individual choice. That's the political expression of respect for the individual. This is a special achievement of Western civilization. Hayek doesn't say other civilizations don't respect the individual, but he insists it's at the core of our civilization, the civilization that descends from both the biblical tradition and the ancient Greek and Roman tradition. That's individualism, and that individualism, which for Hayek is both a moral and spiritual achievement, is critically bound up again with the protection of private property and the system of economic competition. An important point he makes on pages 45 and 46. His book is, you could say, a kind of polemic against planning. Right? Remember how we began? There are two fundamental responses to the question, who chooses? The classical liberal response, the Lockean response, which is the private individual makes the choices. The other, the socialism response, is the state makes the choices. Hayek emphasizes the following. I'm not against, and you shouldn't be either, against all planning. I'm in favor of that kind of planning that enables competition. Think of baseball. In order to determine the best team, we need rules. We need rules that are as clear as possible. And we need umpires to call balls and strikes. But we don't want the umpires telling batters when to swing and when not to swing. We don't want the umpires telling pitchers when to throw fastballs and when to throw sliders. That we leave to the rival coaches. Similarly, Hayek is for that kind of planning that enables competition. What kind of planning is that? Hayek is clear. You need certain basic, settled, established rules everybody can count on concerning, say, contracts. People have to be able to rely upon one another's promises. Promises will not always be honored. You need laws that govern what happens when a solemn promise entered into is breached. You need courts to enforce promises or reward damages when promises have been violated, promises, that is, that have been solemnized. You need a police force. You need an army to protect from foreign dangers. Why? Because there are always foreign dangers. Might a day come when there are no foreign dangers? It might. But since the historical record is devoid of a moment in which there have been no foreign dangers, in the meantime you also need armies. So there are prerequisites for competition. We want our legislators to deliberate over the laws governing courts. We want our courts to think through carefully the elaboration of obligations under contracts and so on. We want a wise foreign policy and so on. Planning there is, not opposed to that planning. What he doesn't want is the central government making the central decisions about economic life. One more point, they'll stop. I've already mentioned this. It's a good place to stop here. According to Hayek, he develops this point on pages 54 through 56. There is a necessary conflict between the socialist ideal and the pursuit of truth. When you give the state the authority for making these massively important economic decisions, the state, with the massive power it's accumulated, can't help but view, I've mentioned this point, dissent or criticism as interference with the efficient implementation of its plans for your benefit. Dissent is not only unwelcome, it must be suppressed for the sake of the collectivity. So again, I'll conclude with this. Hayek is not opposed to what we today think of as social democracy. That is a form of liberal democracy that provides social safety nets, minimums, say in regard to catastrophic health crises. He's not against providing minimums of welfare, minimums of food, shelter, and clothing. That's what we tend to think of as social democracy. I myself would simply call it still liberal democracy. That is a form of political life that protects individual freedom, but democratically makes certain decisions about not letting people fall below minimums. That kind of planning also for Hayek is perfectly consistent with competition. What he's opposed to, though, the difference between what some people call social democracy and democratic socialism, democratic socialists want the central government to take over most important parts of economic life. I repeat, down that road, argues Hayek, lies the extirpation of freedom, and since freedom is essential to human dignity, he opposed it for all of his life after the road to serfdom with all of his magnificent powers.